The air was filled with the scent of fresh paint and old wood as the Wilson family moved into their new home. A charming two-story house that had stood in the neighborhood for nearly a century. John Wilson stepped back from the open truck, wiping sweat from his brow as he surveyed the imposing house. It was old, sure, but that only added to its character. Sarah, his wife, was already inside, busying herself with unpacking boxes. "Lily, keep the cat inside," Sarah called out, her voice muffled by the walls. Lily, their youngest at 8, giggled as she chased their black cat, Whiskers, who darted through the front door and into the hall. Ethan, their 12-year-old, rolled his eyes and went back to his video game, only half paying attention to the commotion around him. John made his way into the house, appreciating the old fixtures and creaky wooden floors. "It just needs some love," he muttered, more to reassure himself than anyone else. The movers finished unloading the last box, and soon enough, the family was officially moved in. They spent the day arranging furniture, hanging curtains, and trying to make the house feel like a home. That evening, they gathered in the living room, which was still cluttered with boxes and half-assembled lamps. Sarah had ordered pizza, and they all sat on the floor to eat. Lily talked excitedly about exploring the new house, especially the hidden corners and old, narrow stairways. Ethan teased her, saying the place probably had ghosts. "It's almost Halloween, you know," he smirked, enjoying the way his sister's eyes widened with a mix of curiosity and fear. "Don't scare your sister," Sarah warned, giving Ethan a pointed look. After dinner, the family settled into their new routines. John was in the living room, unpacking the last of the boxes while Sarah put Lily to bed. As he reached to plug in a lamp, John heard a faint noise, a soft, almost rhythmic hum. He paused, listening closely. It seemed to be coming from the air vent above the fireplace. He dismissed it as nothing more than the old house settling or maybe a draft. But the sound lingered, almost like a whisper. He couldn't make out any words, just a gentle murmur. He shook his head and returned to his task, chalking it up to exhaustion from the long day. That night, Lily couldn't sleep. Her room was right above the living room, and as she lay in bed, she heard a faint noise coming through the vent beside her bed. It wasn't the draft or the hum of air. It sounded like a child's voice, a soft, distant giggle followed by a quiet, almost sorrowful cry. Lily's heart quickened, and she pulled her blanket up to her chin. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. The giggle stopped, replaced by a soft, repetitive tapping. Lily sat up, glancing around her room. The window was shut tight, and the door was closed. She couldn't understand where the sound was coming from. She leaned closer to the vent and heard it again. A small voice, so faint it could have been mistaken for the wind. Lily slipped out of bed and crept into the hallway, the hardwood floors cold against her bare feet. She tiptoed into her parents' room and tapped on the door. "Mom?" she called softly. Sarah stirred, sitting up with a groggy expression. "What is it, honey?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. "I heard." "Someone laughing," Lily said, her voice shaky. Sarah glanced at the clock, almost midnight. "It's probably just the old house making noises," she said, trying to sound reassuring. She walked Lily back to her room, tucked her in, and promised that the house was safe. "It's just new and different. You'll get used to it," she assured her. But as Sarah left, she couldn't shake the feeling that Lily wasn't imagining things. The house did feel off somehow. There was an old, lingering coldness in the air, and despite the autumn chill outside, the vents seemed to carry an unnatural draft. Later, as John lay in bed next to Sarah, he heard the noise again, this time louder and more distinct. It was as if someone was whispering right through the walls. He got up, determined to find the source. Grabbing a flashlight, he searched each room, pausing at every vent to listen. Every time he moved on, he could have sworn he heard the faint murmur shift, almost as if it were following him from room to room. After his second sweep of the house, he returned to the bedroom, scratching his head. "Nothing," he muttered, closing the door softly. Sarah glanced at him but didn't press the issue, sensing his unease. In her room, Lily lay wide awake, listening to the soft murmur through the vent. She wasn't scared anymore. She felt a strange, melancholic connection to the voice. It wasn't threatening, just lonely. She closed her eyes and drifted into a restless sleep, the quiet whisper lulling her like a distant lullaby. In the hallway, the faint, hollow tapping continued through the vents, almost like fingers softly drumming on metal. It resonated through the quiet house, carrying a sadness that lingered in the air long after the lights went out. The next morning, the sun streamed through the windows, chasing away the lingering chill from the night. The family went about their routines. Sarah in the kitchen making breakfast, John getting ready for work, and the kids eating at the table. The mood seemed normal enough, but John couldn't shake the unease from last night's strange sounds. "Did anyone else hear anything weird last night?" John asked casually, pouring coffee into his mug. He expected to hear Ethan complain about creaking floors or the wind howling outside. "Like what?" Ethan mumbled through a mouthful of cereal. "Voices," Lily said quietly, not looking up from her plate. John froze, and Sarah shot him a curious look. "It's just an old house, sweetie," Sarah said, trying to sound dismissive. But Lily's words lingered. After breakfast, John left for work, determined to put the house's strange noises out of his mind. As the kids got ready for school, Lily approached Sarah. "Mom, I wasn't dreaming last night. I heard kids in the vent." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Lily wasn't prone to flights of fancy, and she rarely lied. Trying to calm her daughter, Sarah knelt down. "Sometimes old houses make noises, Lily. Pipes creak, and wind can sound like voices. But there's nothing to worry about, okay?" Lily nodded slowly, but her expression remained unconvinced. "I think they're trying to talk to me." Sarah forced a smile. "Well, maybe you should tell them you're too busy to chat," she joked, trying to lighten the mood. Lily didn't laugh. She simply nodded and went to grab her backpack. That night, the house seemed quieter, and Sarah allowed herself to believe it was all just nerves from the move. But when the lights went out and the family settled into bed, the whispers returned. John was lying awake, staring at the ceiling, when he heard it, a faint, almost rhythmic murmur. He sat up, straining to listen. It seemed to drift in and out, like the ebb and flow of a distant conversation. He got out of bed and went into the hallway, where the noise seemed louder, almost like it was coming from the vents. "Do you hear that?" he whispered to Sarah, who was now awake and sitting up. Sarah shook her head, listening intently. The house was silent, except for the ticking of the clock in the living room. "It's probably just the pipes," she said, trying to dismiss it, though she felt anything but calm. John ran a hand through his hair, feeling foolish. He was letting his imagination run wild. "Yeah, you're right," he muttered and crawled back into bed. In her room, Lily lay wide awake, her eyes fixed on the vent above her bed. She had heard the whispers again, clearer this time. It wasn't just one voice. It was several, overlapping like a distant chorus. She thought she heard a child laughing, followed by a soft, almost inaudible cry. Then the voices quieted, replaced by a repetitive tapping sound. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The tapping stopped abruptly. Lily held her breath, straining to hear any response. But the silence that followed was more unnerving than the noise. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, feeling a chill in the air. She was about to call for her mother when she heard it again, a quiet, sorrowful sob echoing softly through the vent. Lily pressed her ear against the cool metal, her heart pounding in her chest. It felt like the house was breathing with her, exhaling whispers and drawing in her fear. "Mom," she called out, her voice trembling. Sarah was already at the door. She had been standing there for a moment, watching her daughter listen to the vent. Sarah didn't know what to say, but she felt a rising sense of dread that she couldn't shake. Lily turned and saw her mother. "Did you hear them?" "Come on, Lily," Sarah said softly, reaching out her hand. "You need to get some sleep." Lily hesitated but nodded, letting Sarah guide her back to bed. Sarah sat with her until she fell asleep, the room silent except for the quiet hum of the vent. Across the hallway, Ethan was awake too. He hadn't said anything to his parents, not wanting to sound crazy, but he had heard it, the faint whispering and the crying. He couldn't make out any words, but the sound had an unnerving rhythm, almost like a child calling out for help. He turned on his side, trying to ignore it, but the whispers seemed to follow him, echoing through the room. Downstairs, John sat in the living room, unable to sleep. He stared at the vent above the fireplace, hearing that same rhythmic murmur that seemed to follow him through the house. He tried to reason it away. Old pipes, wind drafts, anything to make it make sense. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just a house. There was something else, something lingering just out of sight. As he leaned back in his chair, he swore he heard a voice. A faint, almost pleading whisper that sent chills down his spine. "Help?" The voice seemed to say, barely audible. John closed his eyes, trying to shake off the feeling. He decided he'd investigate more thoroughly tomorrow. Check the vents, look for any possible source of the noise. He convinced himself that there had to be a logical explanation. But as the whispers continued through the night, he wasn't so sure. The next day, the atmosphere in the Wilson house was tense. Sarah couldn't focus at work, and John had been too distracted to get much done at his job either. They both returned home early, each claiming they had some excuse. But the reality was, they were unnerved by the strange events of the previous night. After picking up the kids from school, Sarah found herself back in the house alone while John took Ethan to soccer practice. Lily had run off to play with Whiskers, leaving Sarah to tidy up. As she gathered laundry, she kept glancing nervously at the vents, unable to shake the lingering sensation that someone, or something, was watching her. Her unease peaked when she entered the attic to store some old clothes. As she pushed a box into the far corner, something caught her eye. Tucked deep inside one of the air vents was what looked like a piece of old yellowed paper. She reached in, tugging it free. It was a newspaper clipping, worn and faded, dated over 50 years ago. The headline read, "Fire claims the lives of 7 children. Bodies never recovered." Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she scanned the article. It described a tragic incident involving a fire that had engulfed the house decades ago. The story mentioned that the children were never found, leading to local rumors of haunting and whispers of foul play. Some claimed the children's souls never left. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Could these noises and voices be connected to the children who died here? She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. She took the clipping downstairs, determined to show it to John as soon as he got home. That evening, John arrived with Ethan, both looking exhausted. Sarah was waiting for them in the kitchen, the old clipping laid out on the table. "What's this?" John asked, frowning as he picked up the worn paper. "I found it in one of the vents in the attic," Sarah replied, her voice unsteady. "It's about a fire that happened here years ago. 7 kids. All lost." John read the article, feeling a growing unease. "What are you suggesting, Sarah?" "That this is connected to what's been happening." He kept his voice low, not wanting the kids to hear. "I don't know," she admitted. "But what if it is? What if those noises we've been hearing? What if they're the voices of those children?" John let out a sigh, running a hand through his hair. "This house is old. It makes noises. The vents probably carry sound from outside, or maybe even the neighbors." He sounded like he was trying to convince himself as much as Sarah. "Lily isn't making it up," Sarah insisted, her voice firm. "I heard them too, John, and so did you." John remained silent, staring at the clipping. The photo accompanying the article showed a charred building that looked eerily familiar, an image of their house, engulfed in flames. He felt a cold weight settle in his chest. "Let's not jump to conclusions," he said quietly, placing the clipping back on the table. "We need to be rational about this." Sarah nodded reluctantly, but her mind was already racing. There was something undeniably wrong with this house. And whatever it was, she was certain it wasn't just in their heads. That night, the whispers returned, more distinct and haunting than before. Lily lay awake, listening as the faint cries filtered through the vent above her bed. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the sound, but it seemed to grow louder, echoing in her mind. She sat up abruptly, feeling a strange urge to respond. "Are you there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. For a moment, there was silence. Then she heard it. A child's voice, clear and desperate. "Help us." Lily's heart pounded in her chest. She got out of bed and crept toward the vent, pressing her ear against it. The voice repeated, softer this time, pleading for help. It sounded like a boy, about her age. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. But there was no response. Only silence and the faint sound of breathing from somewhere deep within the house. The following day, John decided to investigate the house more thoroughly. He told Sarah he was going to check the vents, looking for any explanation for the noises. "Maybe there's a draft or a gap somewhere that's letting sound travel," he reasoned, grabbing a flashlight and a small toolkit. As he climbed into the attic, John felt a growing sense of dread. The old wooden beams creaked under his weight, and the musty air felt suffocating. He approached the vent where Sarah had found the clipping, shining his flashlight into its depths. Something caught his eye. A small, burnt toy soldier, wedged inside. John pulled it out, staring at the charred figure in his hand. It was old, with most of the paint scorched off, but it was unmistakably a child's toy. He felt a chill run through him as he carefully placed it in his pocket. He continued searching the vents, finding more remnants. A melted marble, a singed piece of cloth, even a tiny, blackened shoe. Each discovery deepened his sense of dread. These weren't just lost objects. They were remnants of a tragedy that had unfolded within these walls. That evening, John and Sarah sat at the kitchen table, the small collection of charred items laid out in front of them. John didn't know what to say. He had gone looking for a logical explanation, but found only more questions. "What does this mean, John?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," John replied, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "But whatever happened here, it was real." As they sat in silence, the air seemed to grow colder. The house felt alive, its old walls creaking softly as if listening to their conversation. The vents, once a simple part of the house's structure, now seemed like a passageway, an open conduit to something they couldn't fully comprehend. That night, as the family tried to sleep, the cries returned, louder and more insistent than before. But this time, they weren't just distant echoes. They were clear, unmistakable cries for help. And the Wilsons couldn't ignore them any longer. The atmosphere in the house had shifted. The once cozy home now felt oppressive, with a lingering sense of something unseen watching them from the dark corners and hallways. John and Sarah tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy for the sake of their children, but the unease had settled deep into their bones. That evening, as the family gathered in the living room for dinner, the tension was palpable. The television was on, showing some sitcom that no one was really watching. The laughter from the TV felt hollow and out of place in the increasingly eerie house. Lily quietly poked at her food, lost in thought. Ethan glanced at his sister, trying to ignore the strange feeling in the pit of his stomach. He hadn't said anything to his parents, but he had been hearing the whispers too. And the more he heard, the more he felt like someone was standing just behind him, breathing softly down his neck. After dinner, Sarah decided it was time to do something proactive. She couldn't keep ignoring this. It was driving her to the brink. While John took the kids upstairs to get ready for bed, Sarah stayed downstairs, determined to confront whatever was lurking in the shadows of her home. Sarah stood alone in the dimly lit hallway, her reflection barely visible in the old mirror at the end of the corridor. She had read somewhere that old houses held echoes of the past, memories embedded in their walls. She always thought it was a romantic notion until now. The hallway seemed unnaturally quiet, and the vents along the walls seemed to hum with an unseen energy. Sarah approached one of the larger vents and leaned in close, straining to hear anything. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then she heard a faint, almost inaudible whisper. "Help us." Sarah jerked back, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice had been so clear, so desperate. She stood frozen in place, unsure whether she should call out or flee. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and slowly approached the mirror at the end of the hall. She didn't know why, but something compelled her to look. She stepped closer, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the dusty frame. As she wiped away the grime from the glass, her reflection seemed to waver. Her own face stared back at her, but behind her, in the darkness of the hallway, she saw something else. A faint, shadowy figure, barely visible in the dim light. It was the silhouette of a child, its head tilted slightly as if watching her. Sarah gasped and spun around, but the hallway was empty. When she turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone. She stumbled back, clutching her chest as she tried to steady her breathing. The house felt like it was closing in on her, the walls creaking and groaning as if they were alive. She felt a cold draft brush past her, and she shivered despite the warmth of the house. Sarah rushed upstairs, her heart racing. She needed to tell John. They couldn't keep ignoring this. That night, John and Sarah sat in their bedroom, speaking in hushed voices while the children slept. "I saw something, John," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "A shadow in the mirror." "Are you sure it wasn't just a trick of the light?" John asked, though he already knew her answer. "It wasn't the light," Sarah insisted. "It was someone. A child." John sighed heavily, rubbing his forehead. He had been trying to rationalize everything, to find some logical explanation for the noises and the cries. But Sarah's words echoed what he had been feeling all along. Something in this house wasn't right. "Maybe it's time to call someone," John said, reluctantly acknowledging that they were out of their depth. "A professional. Someone who deals with these things." Sarah nodded, her expression grim. "We can't let this go on, John. It's affecting the kids. And it's affecting us." In her room, Lily was restless. She kept hearing the faint whispers through the vent, growing louder with each passing night. But now, they were accompanied by something new. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against the metal. It was unnerving, but she couldn't help but listen, feeling drawn to the sounds. She sat up in bed, her eyes fixed on the vent. She could hear the whispers clearer than ever. Soft voices pleading for help, crying out in desperation. Lily felt a strange sense of sadness wash over her, as if the voices were calling out to her personally. She got out of bed and approached the vent, pressing her ear against the cool metal. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. For a moment, there was silence. Then she heard it, a soft voice, clear and distinct. "Help us, please." Lily's eyes widened in fear. She stumbled back, tripping over her own feet and falling to the floor. She stared at the vent, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt like she was being watched, as if someone, or something, was standing just behind the vent, staring back at her. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. She was frozen in place, unable to tear her eyes away from the dark, empty vent. Across the hall, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He had heard the whispers again, and now he felt something new, a heavy, oppressive presence in his room. He turned his head slowly, his eyes landing on the vent above his bed. He couldn't explain it, but he felt like someone was inside the vent, watching him. The shadows seemed to shift and move, and the air felt thick and suffocating. He wanted to call for his parents, but he couldn't find his voice. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the fear. But the whispers only grew louder, echoing through his mind. As the night wore on, the Wilsons each lay awake, haunted by the shadows that seemed to linger in every corner of their home. The house was no longer just a place to live. It had become a prison, a labyrinth of dark corridors and hidden secrets. And somewhere in the depths of the house, the whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent with each passing hour. John had reached his breaking point. He had tried to rationalize everything, brushing off the strange events as mere byproducts of an old house, but now it was impossible to ignore. The eerie sounds from the vents, the unexplained shadows, and Sarah's mounting fear had made it clear. They had to confront whatever was haunting their home. That morning, John decided to do a full sweep of the house. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, he went through every room, checking every vent, looking for gaps or signs of animals. He searched the basement thoroughly, but found nothing that could explain the sounds. It was almost as if the house was deliberately hiding something from him. He was about to give up when he noticed something odd in the basement. A small door at the far end, half hidden behind a stack of old boxes. The door was old, its paint peeling and hinges rusted. John didn't remember seeing it before, but that seemed impossible. It wasn't like a door could just appear out of nowhere. John approached the door, his heart pounding. He reached for the handle and tried to turn it, but it was locked. He pulled harder, but the door wouldn't budge. He grabbed the crowbar and forced it into the small gap, gritting his teeth as he pried the door open with a loud creak. Behind the door was a narrow crawl space, just big enough for a person to squeeze through. It was dark, and the air smelled stale, like old wood and mildew. John hesitated, a voice in the back of his mind telling him to turn back, but he couldn't. He had to know what was inside. He shined his flashlight into the crawl space and crawled in. The walls were rough and unfinished, and cobwebs brushed against his face as he moved forward. The vent system ran through the crawl space, leading to the main air ducts. John reached one of the vents and peered through it, trying to see if there was anything inside. That's when he noticed something small wedged inside the vent, a charred piece of cloth, burnt at the edges. John pulled it out, feeling a strange sense of dread. It was old, stained with soot, and seemed like it had been there for decades. He looked further and saw more remnants. Small toys, melted marbles, and even a tiny blackened shoe. John's hands trembled as he gathered the items. There was no logical explanation for this. It was as if the remnants were pieces of a tragedy that had happened long ago, hidden away in the walls of the house. As he backed out of the crawl space, John noticed something carved into the wood near the vent. A series of scratch marks, like someone had clawed at the wood in desperation. He ran his fingers over the marks, feeling the rough, splintered edges. They were deep, like they had been made with great force. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. These weren't just remnants of a fire. These were signs of someone trying to escape. John returned to the living room, laying out the small collection of charred items on the coffee table. Sarah entered the room, her eyes widening in shock when she saw the remnants. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I found them in the crawl space," John replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "They must have belonged to the children who died here." Sarah's face paled as she picked up the tiny shoe, her fingers brushing against the burnt fabric. "John, what does this mean?" "I don't know," John admitted, running a hand through his hair. "But it's clear that something terrible happened here, and whatever it was, it's still here." Sarah glanced at the vent in the corner of the room, a cold shiver running down her spine. "We can't keep this from the kids. They need to know." John nodded reluctantly. "I'll talk to them tonight. They deserve to know the truth." That evening, the family gathered in the living room, the air thick with tension. John and Sarah sat across from the kids, trying to find the right words to explain what they had discovered. "There's something we need to tell you," John began, his voice steady but strained. "This house, it has a history. A long time ago, there was a fire here, and some children died." Lily's eyes widened, and Ethan looked down at the floor, his face pale. Sarah reached out to hold Lily's hand, her grip tight and reassuring. "Are they the ones in the vents?" Lily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John exchanged a glance with Sarah before nodding slowly. "We think so. We believe their spirits might still be here, trying to communicate with us." Ethan's hands clenched into fists. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" he demanded, his voice cracking with anger and fear. "We didn't want to scare you," Sarah replied softly. "But we couldn't keep it from you anymore. You deserve to know the truth." Lily's eyes filled with tears. "What do they want?" she asked, her voice trembling. John shook his head, unable to find an answer. He felt a deep sense of helplessness, knowing that there was no clear solution to the nightmare they were facing. They were trapped in a house that held more secrets than they could ever hope to uncover. That night, as the family tried to sleep, the whispers returned, louder, more insistent than ever before. The cries echoed through the vents, filling the house with a sense of despair and hopelessness. In her room, Lily lay awake, listening to the voices with tears in her eyes. She could hear them calling out to her, pleading for help, their voices overlapping in a haunting chorus. "Help us, please." Lily sat up in bed, her heart pounding. She felt a strange compulsion to respond, to help the voices that were trapped in the walls. She slipped out of bed and approached the vent, her fingers trembling as she reached for the cool metal. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. For a moment, there was silence. Then she heard a faint, almost childlike voice, clear and desperate. "We're lost. Help us." Lily's eyes widened in fear. She stumbled back, her heart racing. The voice had been so clear, so real. She turned and ran to her parents' room, tears streaming down her face. "Mom! Dad!" she cried, bursting through the door. John and Sarah sat up, their faces pale with fear. "What is it, Lily?" Sarah asked, reaching out to her daughter. "They're lost," Lily sobbed, her voice shaking. "The children in the vents. They're lost." John felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't know how to respond, how to comfort his daughter when he didn't even understand what was happening. In the silence that followed, the whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent. The house seemed to groan under the weight of its secrets, its dark history echoing through the walls. And somewhere in the darkness, the shadows lingered, waiting. The Wilsons couldn't sleep. The oppressive atmosphere in the house weighed heavily on them, and every creak, every murmur seemed amplified in the dark. Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, staring into the hallway, her heart pounding. She kept thinking about what Lily had said. The children in the vents. They're lost. The words echoed in her mind, making her feel both fearful and responsible. Meanwhile, John was determined to get to the bottom of this. He had been hesitant to acknowledge the reality of what they were experiencing, but he couldn't ignore it any longer. They had to confront whatever was haunting their home. Sarah couldn't shake the unease she felt, and her anxiety grew worse as the whispers became more frequent. That evening, while John put the kids to bed, she lingered in the hallway outside Lily's room, listening to the faint sounds coming through the vents. The old mirror at the end of the hallway caught her eye. There was something unsettling about it. The way its surface seemed to ripple slightly in the dim light. She approached it, feeling drawn to its reflection. As she stood in front of the mirror, Sarah saw her own reflection staring back at her, tired and anxious. But behind her, in the shadows, she noticed a figure. A small child standing silently in the dark. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she turned around, but the hallway was empty. When she looked back at the mirror, the child was gone. Her reflection remained, but she saw something else. Small handprints smudged on the glass, as if a child had pressed their hands against it from the other side. "John," she whispered urgently, backing away from the mirror. John came rushing down the hall, his face pale with concern. "What is it?" "The mirror," Sarah stammered, pointing at it. There was a child. And these handprints." John approached the mirror cautiously, but when he reached it, the handprints were gone. The glass was clear and undisturbed. "It's playing tricks on us, Sarah," John said, trying to sound reassuring, but his voice wavered. He knew there was no point in denying it now. Something was haunting them, and it wasn't going to leave them alone. The next day, John and Sarah decided they needed help. They reached out to a local historian, a woman named Mrs. Parsons, who specialized in researching old homes and their histories. She arrived at the Wilson house that afternoon, a tall, thin woman with silver hair and a stern demeanor. As she entered the house, her eyes narrowed, as if she could sense something was amiss. "This house has quite a history," Mrs. Parsons said, her voice clipped and professional. "It was built in the late 1800s, originally as an orphanage. There were several tragedies over the years, including a fire that claimed the lives of some of the children. It was rebuilt as a private residence, but rumors of hauntings have persisted ever since. Do you think the children who died in the fire could still be here?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Mrs. Parsons gave her a grim look. "It's possible. When a tragedy leaves such a strong emotional imprint, it can anchor spirits to a place. And children's spirits are particularly known for lingering, lost, and confused." John felt a chill run down his spine. "What can we do?" he asked. "I'm not a paranormal investigator," Mrs. Parsons replied. "But if you believe these spirits are trying to communicate, you may need to acknowledge their presence. Sometimes spirits simply want to be heard." That night, the family gathered in the living room, their nerves on edge. John had made up his mind to confront whatever was haunting them. He stood in front of the vent, his heart pounding, and spoke softly. "If there's anyone here, we're listening. Please, tell us what you want." The room was silent, and for a moment, John felt foolish. But then, the air seemed to shift, growing colder. The vent began to hum softly, and the whispers returned, clearer than ever before. "Help us, we're lost." The voices sounded so real, so desperate. Sarah covered her mouth, tears welling up in her eyes. Lily held on to Ethan, her small hands trembling. John felt a deep sense of sorrow, as if he could feel the pain and fear of the children who had died here. "What do you want us to do?" John asked, his voice shaking, but there was no response, only the soft sound of crying echoing through the vents. Later that night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. She decided to check on the kids and quietly slipped out of bed. As she walked down the hallway, she heard the whispers again, faint, almost inaudible, coming from the vent beside Lily's room. Sarah approached the vent, feeling a chill in the air. She knelt down and listened, her heart racing. The whispers were clearer now, and she could hear a child's voice calling out for help. "Help us, find us." Sarah's eyes widened in realization. Find us. That's what the children were trying to say. They weren't just lost in the afterlife. They were lost physically, their remains never recovered after the fire. She rushed to the bedroom and woke John. her voice trembling with urgency. "John, I think they want us to find the remains. That's why they're trapped here." John sat up, his face pale. "But how would we even begin to look? It's been decades since the fire." "I don't know," Sarah admitted, her voice shaking. "But we have to try." In her room, Lily lay awake, listening to the whispers. She felt a strange sense of calm, as if the voices were trying to comfort her. She closed her eyes, and in her mind's eye, she saw a vision. A dark, hidden place beneath the house, where the remains of the lost children were buried. The vision was so vivid, so real. Lily opened her eyes, her heart racing. She knew what she had to do. She slipped out of bed and quietly made her way to the basement, feeling an invisible force guiding her. She approached the small locked door that John had discovered, her fingers trembling as she reached for the handle. The door creaked open, revealing the narrow crawlspace beyond. Lily crawled inside, the air growing colder with each step. She followed the path through the crawlspace, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers grew louder, urging her forward. At the end of the crawlspace, she found a small, dark chamber. The air was thick with the smell of burnt wood and decay. Lily knelt down, her fingers brushing against the dirt floor, and felt something hard beneath the surface. She began to dig, her small hands trembling as she unearthed the charred remains of a toy, a small, burnt doll. Its face melted beyond recognition. Tears streamed down Lily's face as she realized what she had found. The remains of the children. Lily closed her eyes, the whispers fading into silence. She felt a sense of peace wash over her, as if the spirits of the lost children were finally at rest. When she opened her eyes, she saw the faint outline of a figure, a small child, standing in the shadows. The child smiled at her, a look of gratitude in their eyes, before fading away into the darkness. Lily knew that the children had finally been found. The following morning, Lily's discovery sent shockwaves through the family. They gathered around the dining room table, the air heavy with the weight of what she had found. The reality of it all, the lost children, the trapped souls, and the history of the house had become undeniable. "Lily, are you sure about what you saw?" John asked, his voice unsteady. Lily nodded solemnly, her eyes reflecting a maturity beyond her years. "I heard them calling to me. They showed me where they were." Her voice was soft, but there was a certainty in her tone that sent chills down everyone's spine. John glanced at Sarah, and for the first time, they both felt utterly helpless. They were dealing with something far beyond their understanding. "We need to call someone, maybe the police, or, I don't know, an expert," John suggested, his voice cracking with uncertainty. "What will we tell them?" Sarah whispered. "That our daughter found the remains of children from a fire that happened decades ago because she was guided by ghosts?" Even as she said it, the words sounded absurd, yet the truth weighed heavily in the room. Before they could decide what to do, a low groan echoed through the house, as if the walls themselves were sighing. The vents rattled slightly, the sound reverberating through the rooms. The family exchanged uneasy glances. "I don't think the house wants us to leave," Ethan muttered, trying to mask his fear with sarcasm. But his voice trembled slightly, betraying his attempt at humor. That evening, as dusk settled over the house, the tension was palpable. John paced the living room, running a hand through his hair repeatedly. He felt trapped, not just physically but emotionally, by the overwhelming sense of responsibility to protect his family from whatever was haunting them. Sarah had been frantically researching the fire, combing through old newspaper articles online and in the local library's archives. She discovered that the bodies of the children had never been recovered, and rumors had circulated for years about their spirits lingering in the house. But there were no answers, no solutions, only speculation and ghost stories. "John," Sarah said quietly, closing her laptop, "we need to let them rest. Lily showed us where they are. We have to help them move on." John stopped pacing, and looked at her, his expression conflicted. "But how? How do we do that?" "We need to acknowledge them," Sarah replied, her voice trembling. "We need to tell them that we know they're here and that it's time for them to go." That night, the Wilsons gathered in the basement, standing outside the small locked door that led to the crawlspace. Lily held tightly to her mother's hand, while Ethan stood silently beside his father. The air was heavy with an almost tangible sense of sorrow. John cleared his throat, feeling foolish but determined. "If you can hear us, we know you're here. We know what happened to you." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a soft, distant cry echoed through the vent above them. "We're sorry you were lost," Sarah continued, her voice breaking. "But you don't have to stay here anymore. You can go." The cries grew louder, more desperate. Lily felt tears welling up in her eyes as she listened to the voices of the lost children. "We're here to help you," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "It's time to go." The air seemed to grow colder, and a gust of wind swept through the basement, rattling the old vents. The cries turned into soft whispers, and the walls seemed to groan as if the house itself was mourning. Then, slowly, the cries faded into silence. The family stood there for several moments, listening to the heavy silence that followed. It felt as if a great weight had been lifted, and the air seemed lighter, clearer. The sense of unease that had hung over the house for so long was gone. "Did it work?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lily closed her eyes, listening. She felt a warmth spread through her, a sense of peace that she hadn't felt in weeks. She opened her eyes and smiled. "They're gone." John and Sarah exchanged a look of relief, tears streaming down Sarah's face. They embraced their children, holding them tightly, as if afraid the house might change its mind at any moment. But the house remained silent. Over the next few days, the Wilsons began to feel like themselves again. The oppressive atmosphere in the house had lifted, and the whispers and cries were gone. They still felt a lingering sadness for the children who had been trapped for so long, but there was a sense of closure, a feeling that the spirits had finally found peace. However, they knew they couldn't stay. The memories of what had happened were too strong, and the house held too many dark secrets. They decided to move, leaving the old house behind for good. As they packed their belongings, John took one last walk through the house, saying a silent goodbye to the place that had once been their home. He reached the old mirror at the end of the hallway and hesitated, looking into its polished surface. For a moment, he thought he saw a small figure, a child, smiling at him. But when he blinked, the figure was gone. John let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding and turned away. He knew it was time to leave the past behind. The Wilsons left the house that afternoon, watching it grow smaller in the rearview mirror as they drove away. There was a lingering sense of loss, but also relief as they moved on to a new chapter in their lives. But as the house sat empty, its windows dark and its walls silent, a faint rhythmic tapping echoed through the old vents. The house, though now free of its tormented spirits, held on to its memories, waiting for the next family to uncover its dark secrets. The Wilsons had left the house behind, starting a new life in a different town. They rarely spoke of the old house, trying to push the memories aside, but the lingering unease never truly left them. In the silence of their new home, there were moments when Lily still thought she heard faint whispers, but she never mentioned them to her parents. The family was trying to heal, and reopening old wounds seemed like too much to bear. But the house they had left behind was far from forgotten. Several months later, a new family moved into the house. The Thompsons were a young couple, Mark and Emily, with their 3-year-old son, Jake. They had been drawn to the house's old charm and history, and though they had heard rumors about the place, they dismissed them as small-town ghost stories. On their first night in the house, as Mark and Emily unpacked in their bedroom, Jake wandered down the hallway. He was a curious child, always exploring new places, and the old house seemed like a treasure trove of secrets. He found himself in front of the large mirror at the end of the hall, staring at his reflection. "Hi," Jake said cheerfully, waving at himself in the mirror. For a moment, the reflection seemed normal, just a child looking back at himself. But as Jake continued to wave, a small, shadowy figure appeared behind him. A child, slightly older, watching him from the darkness. Jake giggled, not understanding what he was seeing. "Do you want to play?" he asked, turning around. But the hallway was empty. That night, the Thompsons went to bed, exhausted from the long day of moving. Emily fell asleep quickly, but Mark couldn't shake a lingering feeling of unease. He got up to check on Jake and found his son standing in front of the vent in his room, listening intently. "Jake, what are you doing up?" Mark asked, his voice groggy. Jake turned and smiled. "I was talking to my new friend." Mark's heart skipped a beat. "What friend?" "The one in the vent," Jake replied innocently. "He said he's lost." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. He glanced at the vent but saw nothing unusual. He picked Jake up and carried him back to bed, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in his chest. "It's just the wind, buddy. Go back to sleep." But as Mark left the room, he couldn't shake the sensation that someone was watching him. Over the next few days, strange occurrences began to plague the Thompsons. They heard faint whispers coming from the vents, indistinct and distant, like echoes from another time. Emily noticed shadows flickering at the edge of her vision, and Jake continued to talk about his new friends, describing them in startling detail. One evening, as Emily was cleaning the living room, she found an old, burnt toy soldier wedged inside one of the vents. She stared at it, her fingers trembling as she turned it over in her hands. It was charred and damaged, as if it had been through a fire. She showed it to Mark, who brushed it off as something left behind by the previous owners. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just an old toy. "Mark, something's wrong with this house," she said, her voice shaky. "I keep hearing things, and Jake. He keeps talking about children that I've never seen." "It's just an old house," Mark insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. He had heard the whispers too, but he was determined not to let his imagination run wild. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the vents. She got up and walked down the hallway, her footsteps echoing softly in the darkness. As she passed the mirror at the end of the hall, she caught a glimpse of something moving behind her. A shadowy figure, barely visible in the dim light. Emily stopped, her heart pounding, and turned to look at the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, but there was something wrong with it. The eyes of her reflection seemed empty, hollow, as if the person staring back wasn't her at all. Emily took a step back, feeling a cold shiver run down her spine. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The reflection didn't respond. But as she continued to stare, she saw a small handprint appear on the glass, followed by another. The handprints pressed against the mirror, as if children were reaching out from the other side. Emily stumbled backward, gasping in horror. She turned and ran to the bedroom, waking Mark in a panic. "There's something in this house," she said, her voice shaking. "We need to leave. Now." Mark didn't argue. He could see the fear in his wife's eyes, and he had felt the same unease gnawing at him since they moved in. They quickly gathered Jake and drove to a hotel, leaving the house behind. The Thompsons never returned to the house. They decided to sell it and move on with their lives, unwilling to face whatever haunted those old walls. But the house remained, its dark history lingering like a shadow. And somewhere within its depths, the whispers continued, a faint mournful echo of the past, forever trapped in the walls and vents of the old house. And so, the cycle continued.